So now that the Computex dust has settled, I thought I'd share my thoughts on what was probably the most disruptive product announcements in at least a decade. A 12-core CPU in the mainstream desktop market. Who would have thought that would happen just 4 years ago? Navi also made an appearance, and Intel tries to steal away some of AMD's thunder and failed. Oh, and Nvidia has laptops, I guess. I know you are probably overloaded with videos from Computex, so I'll try and keep this one short. Back in November of last year, before we had any leaks or any information on Zen 2, I tried my luck at guessing what Ryzen 3000 would look like. At the top end, I predicted we would see the Ryzen 7 3800X with 16 cores and 32 threads boosting to 4.7 GHz with double DDR3 cache. In reality, it turns out that the top SKU, for now, is the Ryzen 9 3900X with 12 cores and 24 threads boosting to 4.6 GHz. I did get the L3 cache size right, so hooray for me. There's no confirmation that this is a 4.6 GHz all-core boost, but it looks to be that way to me. Interestingly, the Ryzen 7s have two very similar SKUs. The 3800X and the 3700X are both 8 cores and 16 threads, but the former boosts to 4.5 GHz, while the latter to 4.4 GHz. Just 100 MHz difference between these two, but a $70 price difference? Same number of cores, same amount of cache, just 100 MHz more for an extra $70. Doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Well, in that video from November, I said that unlike with Zen 1 and Zen Plus, which have a frequency wall, Zen 2 would probably allow for frequencies to scale higher with an overclock, depending on your cooling solution and the quality of the silicon. And when we look at the TDP for the 3800X, it's set at 105 watts as opposed to 65 watts on the 3700X. And when we look at AMD's X570 motherboard presentation deck, we see that Precision Boost Overdrive and Enhanced Overclock will be available in the new motherboards. I reached out to AMD about this, and it looks like we will be hearing more on overclocking soon from official sources, but I suspect that the reason the 3800X costs $70 more is because it is bin to potentially overclock to higher frequencies compared to the 3700X. Threadripper's Precision Boost Overdrive resulted in a 13% performance increase in certain workloads, so we could see a one-button auto overclock feature in Ryzen Master that results in a wider gap between the 3700X and the 3800X. As for the enhanced overclock feature, it will probably offer greater granularity on the CPUs with higher TDPs, so more enthusiast-level overclocking features for us to play around with. Sounds good to me. The lineup for now ends with the Ryzen 5 3600 and 3600X, which are both 6 cores and 12 threads. The 3600X boosts to 4.4 GHz at 95 watts, while the 3600 to 4.2 at 65 watts. So it looks to me like this 3600 is aimed at OEMs, while the 3600X at $250 is looking like the sweet spot for most enthusiasts that primarily use their systems to game. Again, that higher TDP probably indicates more room for the VRM and the SoC to breathe for those who like to overclock. So if you do like to tinker and don't do much besides gaming, the 3600X is probably all you need. So what's my take on the Ryzen 3000 lineup so far? There's a lot we still don't know, but AMD's numbers certainly look impressive. I think the leaks leading up to this launch set people's expectations a bit too high as far as the frequency numbers are concerned, but you have to remember that the IPC increase of 15% compared to the previous generation will result in significant gains over the current Intel equivalent parts, even if the frequencies are not as high as some expected. To put this into perspective, we're looking at performance dominance from AMD at lower prices, and now with the option to go up to a 12-core beast if you have the extra cache. All this in a context where Intel currently has nothing to compete and nothing on the horizon that will even match this. If you missed my last video, we now have further confirmation that Intel is indeed dead. Personally, if I were to buy one of these, I'm liking the look of the 3700X, and I'm doubtful that that the overclocking potential on the 3800X will be enough to justify this $70 premium. That's $70 that can go into components that will give you a more tangible performance increase than a few extra megahertz, like for instance upgrading to a better GPU. But I'll reserve judgment until we hear what this enhanced overclocking feature brings to the table. I'm also liking the 3900X, although I would have liked to see this at $450. At $500, it's still a good price for what you are getting, don't get me wrong, but when you consider that the X570 motherboards that you'll need to pair with this to extract its full potential are carrying a premium compared to previous gen high-end AM4 motherboards, you are probably looking at $700 to $800 just for the CPU and motherboard alone, and all you are getting is an extra 4 cores and a small bump in frequency when compared to the 3700X. It's a big jump in price for a relatively small jump in performance for most people. There are certainly people who would greatly benefit from a CPU like this, like content creators who are also hardcore gamers. As a content creator myself, I'm not seeing enough of a difference compared to the 3700X to justify the investment, and if you do need more than 8 cores, then you'll probably be better served with last generation's Threadripper CPUs. At the end of the day, what matters is that the 12-core option is there for those who want it, and it wouldn't be if it wasn't for AMD, at least not in the mainstream, so we have to give them credit for raising the bar. Now, what about that 16-core 5GHz Ryzen that was leaked? Brian from Techia City revealed a 16-core Ryzen 3000 engineering sample running at 4.25 GHz on all cores, but at a whopping 1.5 volts. That's a lot more than your typical safe overclock. I think we will see this 16-core CPU in the market before the end of the year. I'm not sure if it will launch on the 7th of July alongside the ones already announced, but I also don't think we will have to wait until next year for this particular 16-core part. But what about the leaked 5 GHz variant? As the 7nm process matures, we will see a 16-core Ryzen at 5 GHz. It's only a matter of time, but I think that will come at a later point, sometime next year as yields get better and the node matures, or maybe in 2021 with Zen 3. Some people have said that AMD is sandbagging the 16-core CPU until Intel reveals Cascade Lake, but Lisa Su has repeatedly said that AMD is aggressively following their roadmap to stay on the edge of technology. That means they will bring out CPUs as soon as they're ready, and they will move to 5nm as soon as TSMC allows them. There is no sandbagging. With the new Ryzen CPUs come the new X570 motherboards and support for PCIe Gen 4. This is a bigger deal than most people realize. The extra speed that PCIe 4 provides is a catalyst for other companies to release compatible products, like PCIe Gen 4 M.2 SSDs at 5 gigs per second read and write speeds. With the trend in NAND prices coming down over the last year, companies are desperate for an avenue to push out new products. Corsair, Gigabyte, Patriot, and many others are using the X570 motherboards and Ryzen 3000 announcements as an opportunity to release a new generation of SSDs. With new CPUs and SSDs now ready to shake up the market, obviously motherboard vendors also have an incentive to release as many models as possible. This gives AMD guaranteed support from motherboard manufacturers, and we're seeing at least 50 models available at launch. Do you know what this is? This is what being a market leader looks like. AMD is now carrying the rest of the PC market along with them. Can you smell that? Yes, that is desperation that you are smelling. Intel is in the house and they brought deceiving benchmarks with them. In an effort to steal some thunder away from AMD, Intel showed off their Ice Lake mobile chips with this graph to showcase their performance gains over Ryzen 3000. Except they are comparing Ice Lake, which is on 10nm, effectively comparable to 7nm, against the Ryzen APUs that are still on 12nm. So a 7nm equivalent versus a 12nm part is a significant handicap for AMD. But even then, the Intel gains aren't really that impressive. But wait, that's not all. When you look at the test systems, the Ice Lake chip was running with much faster RAM at 3733 MHz compared to the 2400 MHz on the Ryzen system. So that's a performance advantage of over 50% just from the RAM alone, which for APUs with integrated graphics does does impact gaming performance massively, and still, the gains are tiny, with even some losses for Intel. That bastion of credibility that is Intel's Ryan Shrout came out publicly to say that the Ryzen APUs don't support RAM speeds over 2400 MHz, so that's the most they could use in this comparison. Okay, but if you're confident in your Ice Lake chips, then surely you could use RAM at the same speed as on the Ryzen APUs to give us consumers a better idea of relative performance. I mean, are we comparing RAM speeds or CPUs here? But desperation doesn't end there. While AMD announced an IPC improvement of 15% over the previous gen Ryzens, Intel also announced that Ice Lake has an IPC improvement of 18% when compared to Skylake from 2015. This would have been a fantastic announcement like 2 years ago. So as many suspected, Intel's 10nm process only offers marginal improvements compared to their own 14nm++ process. Not only is 10nm late, it's also bad. Intel have been relegated to second place with no prospects of a comeback anytime soon. Speaking of comebacks, the Radeon 5700 is back, except this time it's not HD, it's RX. In addition to the new Ryzen chips, AMD also showed off Navi in the form of the curiously named RX 5700. In another video that I published back in November of last year, I talked about some insider info that I got on Navi. I said then that we would get a card equivalent to the RTX 2070 for around $300 and that it would launch in the middle of 2019. I also said in that video that it would have a new architecture, but with several elements of GCN still on it, and it looks like the information I got was pretty much on point, although there are still some doubts about pricing. At the time my channel was really small, and it's always frustrating when you get reliable insider info and viewers tell you that you are just making it up to get some attention. It's understandable really, there's an information overload everywhere you look, and trust is something that I will have to earn over a long period of time. I'm perfectly aware of that, but ultimately 7 months later, it looks like the info that I got was indeed correct, which leads to more information that I got this week from the same source. The price for the RX 5700 is expected to be $399 if Nvidia prices stay the same. If the RTX 2070 drops in price in the next couple of weeks, then the RX 5700 is expected to launch at $379. Now this is that same source that gave me accurate information on Navi a whole 7 months ago. But if there's anything we've learned in these past few months, is that we should always temper our expectations. It's also a 12-layer PCB with a 255mm squared die, which is really quite small for this level of performance, and with 2 power connectors. There is another Navi chip that is around 160mm squared, which will be on the entry-level GPUs. The new RDNA architecture is indeed new, but contains many elements of GCN, just like I said 7 months ago. But there will be an RDNA 2.0 architecture next year that will fully depart from GCN, and that will compete directly with the 2080 Ti. I've heard some other exciting things, but I'll leave those for a future video. Personally, $379 seems like a fair price for the RX 5700, but don't be disappointed if it turns out to be more expensive than that. I'm just telling you what I've heard. Now AMD chose to demo Navi with Strange Brigade running against an RTX 2070, with this new RX 5700 beating it by a claimed 10%. The demo was running at 1440p ultra settings, with the RX 5700 running at approximately 100 frames per second, according to the AMD press release. So that would imply that the RTX 2070 was running at 90 frames per second. If we look at some independent benchmarks for Strange Brigade for the 2070, we see that it actually runs at 101 FPS average with those same settings. That's not 10% slower than an RX 5700 like AMD are claiming in their slides. That's parity, and that's in a game that typically favors AMD GPUs. So either both cards were bottlenecked somewhere and the 5700 is indeed 10% faster than the 2070, or AMD is inflating their numbers a bit there. But to be honest, there's no point in splitting hairs over such a small margin at this point. What matters is that AMD is releasing an RTX 2070 competitor for less money. What about ray tracing? I don't think that there will be a hardware-based solution for ray tracing, especially considering how small the die is. But there will definitely be better support for DXR coming on a software level. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if AMD had a ray tracing demo at E3. So what are my overall thoughts on Navi so far? For enthusiasts, the RX 5700 will be the default 1440p option by the looks of it. For the mass consumer, as we know, Radeon doesn't even exist, so the 5700 will be mostly irrelevant. As for the naming, I think it's better than calling it the 3070 as some previous leaks suggested, and I understand that having 7 in the GPU name has become synonymous with value. Just look at how the success of the 970 and 1070 led to the 2070 becoming the best-selling RTX card, even though it offers the worst value. But I feel like consistency in naming has been a problem with Radeon cards that AMD hasn't been able to solve. Each generation has a different name, which confuses consumers, and the 5700 doesn't do much to fix that. And what about other Navi GPUs? We know that there are at least 2, the 5700 and a cut-down version, but could there be a higher tier card being announced at E3? My source tells me that they're not expecting a higher tier Navi until next year, but we did see ASRock show off 3 different cooler designs for Navi. Why would ASRock be showing 3 models if there are only 2 coming? The one on the left looks like a rip-off of the Asus ROG Matrix 2080 Ti, while the one on the far right looks a lot like the colorful 2080 Ti cooler. Yes, colorful is the brand name. So those to me look like coolers that you'd see on top tier cards, but I could be reading too much into it. There are no rumors or any indication that there will be an RX 5800 at E3, but there is an almost 15% gap between the RX 5700 and the Radeon 7, so there's definitely room there for another GPU. Now, for a bit of fun, what would a Ryzen plus Navi PC upgrade look like with the information we got so far? Assuming you already have a case, DDR4 RAM, and a power supply, you're looking at just over $1,000 for this all AMD upgrade to a balanced high frame rate 1440p gaming / productivity machine. If you go with the 3800X, you will probably need a better motherboard, something around the $250 range to really get the most out of it. Assuming that better overclocking potential is indeed the added value of the 3800X compared to the 3700X, so that will bump up the price significantly. This is why I feel like the 3700X is really the sweet spot for most enthusiasts. For the more budget conscious out there, a more reasonable upgrade could be the Ryzen 3600X with a supported B450 motherboard instead of these new X570 ones, plus the Radeon RX 5700 of course. I'm assuming here this would be an upgrade for someone coming from a DDR3 platform, so adding RAM to this upgrade package would bring you to a total of $776 for a high frame rate 1440p machine for gaming. If you've been waiting to upgrade your system for the last few years, this is looking like the more affordable way to go, especially considering that with similarly priced Intel and Nvidia parts, you'd get much lower performance. Of course, the sky's the limit, and if you have the monies, you can go crazy with the 3900X together with the Radeon 7 or even a 2080 Ti for 4K gaming. In my opinion, the jump to 4K, when you consider the price of a high refresh rate 4K monitor and a GPU to drive it, is still prohibitive for most people, which is why I feel like the 3700X coupled with the RX 5700 will be the new price to performance sweet spot for PC enthusiasts this year. It kind of reminds me of when we got the i5 6600K plus the GTX 970 a few years ago, which was the go-to balanced build for 1080p gaming, except this time the sweet spot is all AMD. Nvidia is too expensive for what you get, and Intel is too far behind, so for your next PC, going all AMD seems like the smart choice. Of course, Nvidia does have something super that they've been teasing. Will there be a 2070 Ti announced at E3? Almost certainly. This quick look at Computex 2019 was made possible by my awesome patrons. You can join them for just $1 per month and get exclusive access to the Cortex Discord server, where you can talk directly with me and like-minded enthusiasts and stay up to date with the latest hardware news. If you can't contribute financially at this time, then please share this video on social media, as that really helps. Thanks for watching, and until the next one.